The notification sound from her phone made Sarah Chen's blood run cold. Another missed call from Marcus Rodriguez, the man she'd spent 2 years in therapy trying to forget, the man who had left bruises on her arms and scars on her soul, the man she thought she'd finally escaped from 6 months ago when she moved 3 states away to Portland, Oregon. What made her stomach twist even more was the text message that followed. "Your mom gave me your new address. We need to talk." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah stared at the screen in her small downtown apartment, her hands trembling as the words sank in. Her mother, Linda Chen, the woman who had held her while she cried after each violent episode, who had driven her to the emergency room that final night when Marcus had thrown her down the stairs, who had helped her pack her belongings in secret while he was at work, that same mother had just handed over the one piece of information that could destroy the new life Sarah had built. The phone in Sarah's apartment continued to buzz with increasingly aggressive messages throughout the evening. Each notification felt like a punch to her chest, dragging her back to those dark months when Marcus had controlled every aspect of her existence. She had changed her number twice, deleted all social media accounts, and told only 3 people where she was going when she left Phoenix, Arizona: her best friend Jessica, her therapist Dr. Williams, and her mother. Sarah's new life in Portland had been everything she had dreamed of during those terrifying nights when she'd lie awake planning her escape. She worked as a graphic designer for a small but thriving marketing agency, had made genuine friendships with her coworkers, and, for the first time in years, felt like herself again. Her apartment was small but bright, filled with plants and artwork that she had chosen herself, without fear of someone criticizing her taste or destroying her belongings in a fit of rage. The irony wasn't lost on her that she had moved to Portland partly because her mother had suggested it. Linda had researched domestic violence resources in various cities and had specifically mentioned Portland's support systems and job opportunities. They had spent hours together planning Sarah's escape, with Linda even offering to help financially once Sarah was settled. The betrayal cut deeper because of how much trust Sarah had placed in her mother during her most vulnerable time. Her phone rang again, this time showing her mother's contact photo. Sarah stared at the smiling image of Linda taken during last Christmas, before everything had fallen apart with Marcus, when Sarah had still believed she could make the relationship work. She let it go to voicemail, then immediately regretted it. Whatever her mother had to say, Sarah needed to hear it directly. When she called back, Linda answered on the first ring. "Sarah, honey, thank God you're okay. I've been worried sick." "Worried sick?" Sarah's voice was sharper than she intended. "Mom, please tell me you didn't actually give Marcus my address." There was a pause that stretched too long, and Sarah felt her heart sink. Linda's voice, when she finally spoke, was defensive and strained. "Sarah, he's been calling me every day for weeks. He sounds different. He says he's been going to therapy, that he's changed." "You gave him my address." It wasn't a question anymore. "He was so desperate, sweetheart. He loves you. And I thought maybe if you two could just talk, as adults, you could work things out. You seemed so happy together in the beginning." Sarah closed her eyes, remembering those early months with Marcus when he had been charming and attentive before the control and jealousy had started, before the first time he had grabbed her wrist so hard it left fingerprint bruises, before he had isolated her from her friends and made her question her own memory of events. "Mom, he threw me down the stairs. You drove me to the hospital. You saw the X-rays of my cracked ribs." I know, but people can change, Sarah. And he seemed so genuine when he called. He cried on the phone. He's gotten help. The manipulation was so familiar, it made Sarah nauseous. Marcus had always been excellent at performing remorse, at convincing others that his violence was just a momentary lapse, a misunderstanding. He had fooled Sarah's friends before, had convinced her coworkers that she was being dramatic about minor disagreements. Now he had managed to fool her mother. "Where is he now?" Sarah asked, already knowing the answer would terrify her. "He said he was driving to Portland tonight." "Sarah, just hear him out. Give him one chance to explain." Sarah hung up and immediately called Jessica, her hands shaking as she dialed. Jessica answered groggily, clearly having been asleep. Sarah, it's almost midnight. What's wrong? He found me. Marcus found me. My mom gave him my address. Jessica was fully awake now. What? Your mom did what? She thinks he's changed. She thinks we should work things out. Sarah was pacing her apartment now, checking and rechecking that all her locks were secure. Jess, he could be here already. He could be outside right now. I'm calling the police, Jessica said without hesitation. And tell them what? That my ex-boyfriend might be in town and my mom gave him my address? He hasn't actually done anything yet. Sarah, you have that restraining order from Arizona. If he comes near you, that's a violation. Sarah had forgotten about the restraining order in her panic. She had filed it during those final weeks in Phoenix, after Marcus had shown up at her workplace and caused a scene that had embarrassed her in front of her boss and colleagues. The order prohibited him from coming within 500 feet of her, contacting her directly, or contacting her through third parties. But that's an Arizona order. Does it even apply here? Restraining orders cross state lines, Sarah. If he's here, if he tries to contact you, he's breaking federal law. After Jessica hung up, promising to drive over first thing in the morning, Sarah sat in her living room with all the lights on, curtains drawn, trying to process what was happening. Her mother's betrayal felt almost worse than Marcus finding her. She could understand, in a twisted way, why Marcus would manipulate and lie to track her down. That was who he was. But her mother was supposed to protect her. The next morning brought no relief. Sarah had barely slept, jumping at every sound from the hallway outside her apartment. When Jessica arrived with coffee and bagels, Sarah looked exhausted and defeated. "Any more messages from him?" Jessica asked, settling onto the couch beside her friend. Sarah showed her the phone. 7 more texts throughout the night, each more demanding than the last. The final one, sent at 4 in the morning, simply said, "I'm here. We're going to talk whether you want to or not." "That's a clear threat," Jessica said. "We're going to the police station right now." The Portland Police Bureau's domestic violence unit was more helpful than Sarah had expected. Officer Martinez, a woman in her 40s with kind but serious eyes, listened to Sarah's story without judgment and examined the restraining order from Arizona. "This is absolutely enforceable here," Officer Martinez confirmed. "Any contact from him, any attempt to approach you, is a violation. The fact that he crossed state lines actually makes this a federal issue as well. But he hasn't actually approached me yet. He's just sent messages." The messages themselves are violations. He's contacting you directly, which the order prohibits. And this message about talking to you, whether you want to or not, sounds like intimidation to me. Officer Martinez helped Sarah file a report and updated the restraining order to include her current Portland address. She also gave Sarah information about local domestic violence resources and a direct phone number to call if Marcus appeared. "One more thing," Officer Martinez said as they finished the paperwork. "You mentioned your mother."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Your address. That could potentially be considered a violation too, depending on the specific language of your restraining order. Sarah felt a chill. What do you mean? Most restraining orders include language prohibiting contact through third parties. If your mother knowingly provided information that allowed him to contact or locate you, she may have violated the order herself. The drive back to her apartment felt surreal. Sarah had come to Portland to escape one nightmare, only to find herself in another one. But this time, she wasn't the same person who had endured months of abuse in Phoenix. This time, she had resources, knowledge, and most importantly, a clear understanding of what Marcus was capable of. Her phone rang as Jessica pulled into the parking lot of Sarah's building. It was her mother again. This time, Sarah answered. "Sarah, honey, Marcus called me this morning. He said you won't answer his calls or texts. He's really hurt that you won't even give him a chance to apologize." "Mom, do you understand what you've done? You've put me in danger. You violated my restraining order." "Oh, don't be so dramatic, Sarah. He just wants to talk. He sent me a text at 4 in the morning saying we're going to talk whether I want to or not. Does that sound like someone who just wants to apologize?" Linda's voice became defensive again. "You're taking that the wrong way. He's frustrated because you won't communicate with him. If you would just have one conversation, this could all be resolved." Sarah looked at Jessica, who was shaking her head in disbelief. Mom, I need you to listen to me very carefully. Do not give Marcus any more information about me. Do not tell him where I work, where I live, who I'm friends with, nothing. Sarah, I'm your mother. I know what's best for you. This running away isn't solving anything. If you contact him again, if you give him any information about me, I will include you in the restraining order. The line went quiet. When Linda spoke again, her voice was cold. You would do that to your own mother? Over some boy? That boy broke my ribs, Mom. That boy made me afraid to come home to my own apartment. That boy made me change my name at work because he kept calling and harassing my coworkers. People make mistakes, Sarah. Relationships require forgiveness and compromise. Sarah hung up, feeling a mixture of anger and heartbreak. Jessica reached over and squeezed her hand. I can't believe she's still defending him, Jessica said. I can, Sarah replied quietly. Marcus has always been good at manipulating people, and my mom, she's always believed that any relationship is better than being alone. She stayed with my dad for 15 years, even though he was emotionally abusive. She thinks I should do the same. They spent the rest of the morning researching domestic violence laws and resources. Sarah learned that restraining orders could indeed be expanded to include third parties who helped the abuser violate the order, even family members. She also discovered that Marcus's decision to cross state lines to contact her elevated his violations to federal crimes, which carried much more serious penalties than state-level violations. Around noon, Sarah's work phone rang. It was her boss, Patricia, calling from the marketing agency. Sarah, I hate to bother you on your day off, but there's a man here asking for you. He says he's your boyfriend from Arizona and that it's urgent. Sarah's blood went cold. Patricia, please don't give him any information. Call the police. He seems very upset, but he's been polite. Are you sure you don't want me to just give him your cell number? Patricia, I have a restraining order against him. He's not allowed to contact me or try to find me. Please call the police right now. Patricia's voice changed immediately. Oh my God, Sarah, I'm so sorry. I'll call them right now. Jessica was already grabbing her car keys. We need to get there before he leaves. If the police can catch him at your work, they can arrest him. They drove through Portland's afternoon traffic with Sarah's heart pounding. She called
Officer Martinez on the way to explain what was happening. We'll have units there in 5 minutes, Officer Martinez promised. Don't go there yourself. Let us handle this. But by the time police arrived at the marketing agency, Marcus was gone. Patricia told them he had become agitated when she refused to give him Sarah's information and had left quickly when she mentioned calling the police. He was definitely here, Patricia told Officer Martinez. Tall, dark hair, very intense eyes. He kept asking where Sarah lived and when she would be back to work. Officer Martinez turned to Sarah. This is another clear violation. We have witnesses now. I'm going to put out a BLO alert for him. The rest of the week passed in a blur of anxiety and hypervigilance. Sarah found herself jumping at every sound, checking over her shoulder constantly and barely sleeping. Marcus hadn't attempted to contact her directly since the morning after her mother had given him her address, but she knew he was still in Portland. Jessica had started staying over most nights, and Sarah's other coworkers from the agency had rallied around her, offering support and keeping watch at the office. On Friday evening, Sarah's mother called again. Marcus came by the house, Linda said without preamble. Sarah's heart stopped. What house? Your house in Phoenix? Yes. He's very upset, Sarah. He says the police are looking for him because of you. He says you're trying to ruin his life. Mom, what did you tell him? I told him the truth, that you're being stubborn and dramatic, but that I'm sure if he's patient, you'll come around. Did you tell him anything else about where I am or what I'm doing? There was a pause. I may have mentioned that you seemed to be settling in well in Portland, that you liked your new job. Sarah felt sick. Mom, you need to stop talking to him. You're helping him stalk me. Sarah, that's a terrible thing to say. I'm trying to help both of you work through this. There is no working through this, Mom. He abused me. He violated a restraining order by coming to Portland. He's facing federal charges. You're exaggerating, as usual. And even if things got out of hand before, people can change. Look at your father and me. Dad never changed, Mom. You just learned to accept the way he treated you. I won't do that. When Sarah hung up, she immediately called Officer Martinez to report that Marcus had been in contact with her mother again and that her mother had provided him with information about Sarah's life in Portland. This is definitely a pattern of third-party contact, Officer Martinez said. Your mother is helping him violate the restraining order. You have grounds to include her in the order if you want to. The thought of taking legal action against her own mother made Sarah feel sick, but she was beginning to realize she might not have a choice. Every conversation with Linda resulted in more information being passed to Marcus, putting Sarah in greater danger. That weekend, Sarah made a decision that 6 months ago would have seemed impossible. She began researching how to expand her restraining order to include her mother. The process was more straightforward than she had expected. She would need to document all the instances where Linda had provided information to Marcus, show that these actions were helping him violate the existing order, and demonstrate that Linda's contact with Marcus posed a continued threat to Sarah's safety. As she worked on gathering evidence, Sarah reflected on how much she had changed since leaving Phoenix. The terrified, isolated woman who believed Marcus's threats and manipulation had been replaced by someone who understood her rights and was willing to fight for her safety. The process was painful, especially when it came to taking action against her own mother. But Sarah finally understood that protecting herself had to come first. Sunday evening brought another call from Linda, and this time, Sarah was ready. Sarah, I'm very disappointed in you. Marcus told me you had him arrested. What do you mean arrested? The police came to his hotel yesterday
and arrested him. He's in jail because of your lies. Sarah felt a surge of relief mixed with satisfaction. The BLO alert had worked. Marcus was finally facing consequences for his actions. Mom, he was arrested because he violated a restraining order, because he stalked me across 3 states, because he tried to contact me at work after being explicitly told not to. He loves you, Sarah. He's sitting in jail right now because he loves you. No, Mom, he's sitting in jail because he's an abuser who couldn't accept that I left him. Well, I hope you're happy. You've ruined a good man's life over nothing. Sarah took a deep breath, thinking about all the research she had done over the weekend. Mom, I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen carefully. I'm expanding my restraining order to include you. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for so long that Sarah wondered if the call had been dropped. You can't be serious, Linda finally said. I'm completely serious. You violated my restraining order multiple times by providing Marcus with information about me. You've put me in danger, and you've shown that you can't be trusted to respect my safety or my decisions. Sarah, I'm your mother. And Marcus was my boyfriend. That doesn't give either of you the right to abuse me or put me in danger. I would never hurt you. You already have, Mom. Every time you talked to Marcus, every time you gave him information about me, you hurt me. You helped him terrorize me. Linda's voice turned sharp and angry. Fine. If that's how you want to treat the woman who raised you, who sacrificed everything for you, then go ahead. But don't come crying to me when you realize what a mistake you're making. I won't, Sarah said quietly, and hung up. The next morning, Sarah went to the courthouse with Jessica and Officer Martinez to file the paperwork expanding her restraining order. The process was emotional but straightforward. Sarah had documented every conversation with her mother, every piece of information Linda had passed to Marcus, and every way those actions had helped Marcus locate and threaten her. The judge who reviewed the petition was a woman in her 60s who had clearly handled many domestic violence cases. She listened to Sarah's testimony with attention and compassion. Miss Chen, the judge said after reviewing all the evidence, I'm sorry you've had to take this step with your own mother, but you're absolutely right that third-party violations are just as serious as direct violations. Your mother's actions have clearly enabled your abuser to continue harassing and threatening you. The expanded restraining order was granted immediately, prohibiting Linda from contacting Sarah directly or indirectly, from providing any information about Sarah to Marcus or anyone acting on his behalf, and from coming within 500 feet of Sarah's home, workplace, or any other location where Sarah might be regularly found. As they left the courthouse, Sarah felt a complex mixture of emotions. Relief that she finally had legal protection from both Marcus and her mother's enabling behavior. Sadness that their relationship had reached this point, and underneath it all, a growing sense of her own strength and agency. "How do you feel?" Jessica asked as they walked to the car. Sarah thought for a moment. "Free," she said finally. "For the first time in years, I feel completely free." Officer Martinez had stayed with them through the court proceedings, and she walked them to their car. "I want you to know, Sarah, that what you did today took incredible courage. A lot of people wouldn't be willing to take action against a family member, even when that family member is enabling abuse. I spent so many years thinking I had to choose between being safe and keeping my family relationships. I finally realized that anyone who puts me in danger isn't really family at all." As they drove back through Portland, Sarah looked out at the city she had chosen as her fresh start. 6 months ago, she had arrived here broken and afraid, running from one person. Today, she had taken legal action to protect herself from 2 people.
Protect herself from 2 people, including her own mother. The growth felt profound and empowering. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number, but she recognized the area code as Phoenix. For a moment, her old panic started to rise, but then she remembered that Marcus was still in jail and that her mother was now legally prohibited from contacting her. The text was from her Aunt Maria, Linda's sister. "Sarah, your mom told me what happened. I'm so proud of you for standing up for yourself. If you need anything, I'm here for you." Sarah smiled, realizing that taking action to protect herself had also revealed who in her family truly supported her safety and well-being. As Jessica pulled into the parking lot of her apartment building, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in years: complete confidence in her own judgment and decisions. The woman who had been too afraid to leave an abusive relationship for months, who had let that same relationship isolate her from friends and opportunities, who had been manipulated into believing she was overreacting to violence, no longer existed. In her place was someone who understood her worth, knew her rights, and was willing to take whatever action was necessary to protect her future. Marcus's arrest had made the local news, with reporters noting that he had been charged with multiple federal crimes related to stalking and violating protective orders across state lines. Sarah didn't feel vindictive about his situation, but she felt satisfied that the legal system was finally taking his behavior seriously. More importantly, she had learned that she couldn't rely on others, even family members, to prioritize her safety if they weren't willing to understand the reality of domestic violence. The restraining order against her mother felt like the final step in taking complete control of her own life. As she settled into her apartment that evening, Sarah realized that Portland truly felt like home now, not because she was running from something, but because she had actively chosen to build a life here on her own terms. The betrayal that had initially felt like it would destroy her had actually revealed her own strength and resilience. Tomorrow, she would go back to work at the marketing agency, continue building friendships with people who respected and supported her, and keep creating the life she wanted. For the first time since leaving Phoenix, she felt truly optimistic about her future. The phone calls from unknown numbers had stopped. The threatening messages had ended with Marcus's arrest. And most importantly, the voice in her head that had once told her she deserved the abuse, that she was overreacting, that she should try harder to make relationships work, had been replaced by a clear understanding of her own worth and boundaries. Sarah's story wasn't just about escaping an abusive relationship, or even about the complex betrayal of a family member who enabled that abuse. It was about the journey from victim to survivor to someone who not only protected herself, but helped ensure her abuser faced real consequences for his actions. She had transformed from someone who accepted others' definitions of what she deserved to someone who actively created the life she wanted, regardless of who tried to stand in her way. 3 weeks after Marcus's arrest, Sarah received a call that changed everything. It was from District Attorney Rachel Morrison's office, and the voice on the other end belonged to prosecutor Janet Walsh, who specialized in domestic violence cases that cross state lines. "Miss Chen,
I'm calling about the Marcus Rodriguez case. We've been building our prosecution, and I need to discuss some developments with you. Sarah settled into her desk chair at work, grateful that her boss Patricia had been understanding about taking these calls during business hours. The marketing agency had become a sanctuary for her, a place where people knew her story and supported her without judgment. What kind of developments? Sarah asked, though she had a feeling she already knew the direction this conversation would take. Miss
Rodriguez posted bail yesterday morning. He's been released pending trial. The words hit Sarah like ice water. She had allowed herself to believe that Marcus being in jail meant she was safe, that the legal system had finally contained the threat he posed. The reality that he was free again, somewhere in Portland or possibly already on his way back to Phoenix, made her hands shake. But the charges were federal, Sarah said, trying to keep her voice steady. I thought federal crimes meant no bail. Unfortunately, his attorney argued successfully that he wasn't a flight risk since he surrendered his passport and agreed to electronic monitoring. The judge set bail at $50,000, which his family apparently posted immediately. Sarah closed her eyes, remembering Marcus's family. His parents owned a successful construction company in Phoenix and had always treated Marcus like their golden child who could do no wrong. They had never liked Sarah, had always made subtle comments about her being too ambitious, too independent. She wasn't surprised they had bailed him out, probably believing his version of events that painted Sarah as vindictive and dramatic. Where is he now? Sarah asked. He's required to stay in Arizona pending trial. He's wearing an ankle monitor, and he's supposed to check in with a probation officer twice a week. But, Miss Chen, I need to be honest with you about something. The prosecutor's tone made Sarah's stomach clench. What is it? We've discovered that your mother has been in contact with Mr. Rodriguez's family. According to phone records we subpoenaed, she's spoken with his mother, Elena Rodriguez, multiple times since his arrest. Sarah felt the familiar surge of anger and betrayal that had become associated with any mention of her mother. Even with a restraining order in place, Linda was still finding ways to insert herself into the situation, still finding ways to enable Marcus's harassment. What did she tell them? That's what we need to determine. The calls were lengthy, some lasting over an hour. We're working on getting the content, but these communications could potentially constitute violations of your restraining order against your mother. Janet Walsh explained that the prosecution team had been building a comprehensive case against Marcus that went beyond just the restraining order violations. They had discovered a pattern of behavior that included previous complaints from other women, incidents that had never resulted in charges, but that painted a picture of escalating domestic violence. The good news is that crossing state lines to stalk you elevates this to federal stalking charges, which carry much more serious penalties than state-level domestic violence crimes. We're looking at possible sentences of 5 to 10 years if he's convicted on all charges. But there was more troubling news. Marcus's defense attorney had filed motions challenging the validity of the Arizona restraining order, claiming that Sarah had exaggerated the incidents that led to its issuance. They were painting Sarah as a vindictive ex-girlfriend who was using the legal system to punish Marcus for ending their relationship. It's a common defense strategy in these cases, Janet explained. They tried to flip the narrative and make the victim look like the aggressor. That's why the communications between your mother and the Rodriguez family are so concerning. If your mother is providing information that supports their version of events, it could seriously damage our case. After the call ended, Sarah sat in her office trying to process everything she had learned. Marcus was free, her mother was still actively working against her, and now Sarah's credibility was being questioned in court documents. The progress she had felt after getting the restraining orders suddenly felt fragile and temporary. Jessica found her there an hour later, staring out the window at downtown Portland with tears streaming down her face. Sarah, Patricia told me you got bad news. What happened? Sarah explained everything Janet Walsh had told her, watching Jessica's expression grow
more serious with each detail. I can't believe your mom is still doing this, Jessica said. Even after the restraining order, even after seeing how much pain this has caused you? I think that's what hurts the most, Sarah admitted. I could understand if she was just naive about Marcus, if she didn't realize how dangerous he was. But she's actively working to undermine me now. She's helping his family build a case against me. Jessica pulled her chair closer to Sarah's desk. What are you going to do? I don't know. The prosecutor wants me to come in tomorrow to discuss strategy. She wants to prepare me for the possibility that this case might go to trial and that my mother might be called as a witness for the defense. The thought of facing both Marcus and her mother in a courtroom felt overwhelming. Sarah had spent months building a new life in Portland, creating distance from the trauma and manipulation. Now it seemed like that trauma was following her, demanding her attention and energy in ways that felt exhausting. That evening, Sarah called her Aunt Maria, Linda's sister who had been supportive throughout the entire ordeal. Maria lived in Phoenix and had witnessed some of the dynamics between Linda and Marcus firsthand. "Sarah, I'm so glad you called. I've been worried about you since I heard Marcus was released." "Aunt Maria, do you know anything about Mom talking to Marcus's family?" There was a long pause before Maria answered. "I was hoping you wouldn't find out about that." "Yes, Linda has been talking to Elena Rodriguez regularly. She's convinced that Elena is a voice of reason who can help mediate between you and Marcus." "Mediate what? There's nothing to mediate. He abused me, he violated a restraining order, and he's facing federal charges?" "I know, sweetheart. I've tried to talk to your mother, but she's absolutely convinced that this is all a misunderstanding that's gotten blown out of proportion. She thinks if everyone would just sit down and talk rationally, it could all be worked out." Maria went on to explain that Linda had been telling Elena Rodriguez stories about Sarah's childhood, painting her as someone who had always been dramatic and prone to exaggeration. She had shared details about Sarah's therapy sessions, her struggles with anxiety after leaving Marcus, and her decision to move to Portland. "She's giving them ammunition to use against you in court," Maria said bluntly. "Elena has been taking notes during their conversations and sharing them with Marcus's attorney." Sarah felt sick. Her own mother was actively helping to build a legal defense that would portray Sarah as an unstable, vindictive woman who couldn't be trusted. Every private detail Linda shared, every story about Sarah's emotional state after the abuse would be twisted to support Marcus's version of events. "There's something else," Maria continued reluctantly. "Linda has been telling people that she thinks you might have fabricated some of the abuse incidents. She says she never actually saw Marcus hit you, that you just showed up with bruises and claimed he caused them." The betrayal felt complete now. It wasn't just that Linda was enabling Marcus or failing to protect Sarah. She was actively participating in gaslighting her own daughter, denying the reality of abuse that Linda had witnessed firsthand. "She drove me to the emergency room. She saw the x-rays of my broken ribs. She helped me take pictures of the bruises for evidence." "I know, sweetheart. I remember. I was there when she called me crying after that night, saying she was scared Marcus was going to kill you." But somehow she's convinced herself that her memory is wrong, that maybe you fell down the stairs on your own. After hanging up with Maria, Sarah spent the evening researching legal options for dealing with her mother's continued interference. She discovered that witness tampering and obstruction of justice were serious federal crimes, especially when they involved ongoing criminal cases. The next morning, Sarah met with Janet Walsh at the district attorney's office.
The prosecutor was a woman in her 40s with short gray hair and intense blue eyes that suggested she had seen too many cases like Sarah's. "I've been reviewing the phone records between your mother and Elena Rodriguez," Janet said without preamble. "There have been 14 calls in the past 3 weeks, totaling over 18 hours of conversation. That's an extraordinary amount of communication for people who barely knew each other before this case." Janet spread out several documents on the conference table between them. Phone records, email printouts, and what appeared to be handwritten notes filled the pages. "Elena Rodriguez has been documenting these conversations and sharing the information with Marcus's defense team. Your mother has provided detailed information about your mental health history, your relationship patterns, and your motivations for moving to Portland." Sarah looked at the documents, recognizing her mother's voice in the quoted passages, even though the words were filtered through Elena Rodriguez's perspective. Linda had shared that Sarah had always been sensitive and prone to overreacting. She had told Elena that Sarah had a pattern of ending relationships dramatically when things didn't go her way. Most damaging of all, she had suggested that Sarah might be using the legal system to get revenge on Marcus for some perceived slight. "This is devastating to our case," Janet said bluntly. "A prosecutor's worst nightmare is when the victim's own family contradicts their testimony. Defense attorneys love nothing more than being able to say, even her own mother doesn't believe her." Sarah felt her world tilting. "So what does this mean? Are you dropping the charges?" "Absolutely not. Marcus Rodriguez crossed state lines to stalk and harass you. He violated a restraining order multiple times. Those are facts, regardless of what your mother says about your character. But I need you to understand that this case just became much more difficult to prosecute." Janet explained that they would need to build an even stronger case, one that didn't rely solely on Sarah's testimony. They would need medical records, witness statements from people who had seen the abuse or its aftermath, and documentation of Marcus's pattern of behavior with previous partners. The good news is that we've found 2 other women who are willing to testify about similar experiences with Marcus. One is Amanda Flores, who dated him briefly before you. The other is Jennifer Kim, who he was involved with in college. Sarah remembered Amanda vaguely. Marcus had mentioned her as a crazy ex who had tried to cause trouble for him. Now Sarah wondered if Amanda's trouble had actually been trying to warn people about Marcus's behavior. Both women have similar stories: controlling behavior that escalated to physical violence, stalking after they ended the relationships, and manipulation of family members and friends to continue harassment after direct contact was prohibited. The pattern was becoming clear. Marcus had refined his tactics over years of abusive relationships. He knew how to manipulate family members, how to present himself as the wounded party, how to make his victims look unstable and vindictive. Sarah's mother had simply become his latest tool. "What about the restraining order against my mother?" Sarah asked. "Does her contact with the Rodriguez family violate that?" "Potentially. The order prohibits her from providing information about you to Marcus or anyone acting on his behalf. If we can prove that Elena Rodriguez was acting on Marcus's behalf when she solicited information from your mother, then yes, it's a violation." Janet pulled out another set of documents. "That's where this gets interesting. We subpoenaed Marcus's phone records as well, and guess what we found?" The records showed multiple calls between Marcus and his mother Elena during the same time periods when Elena was talking to Linda from Sarah's house.
Coaching his mother on what information to get from your mother. If that's the case, Elena was definitely acting on his behalf, which makes your mother's cooperation a clear violation of the restraining order. Sarah felt a mixture of vindication and sadness. Her mother's actions weren't just emotionally damaging, they were illegal. Linda had crossed the line from enabling abuse to actively participating in obstruction of justice. "I want to file charges against my mother," Sarah said, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. Janet studied her carefully. "Are you sure? Prosecuting your own mother will be emotionally difficult, and it might not help our case against Marcus. Defense attorneys could use it to paint you as someone who destroys family relationships for attention. My mother destroyed our relationship when she decided to help my abuser. If I don't hold her accountable, she'll keep doing this. Maybe not to me, but to someone else. She needs to understand that enabling abuse has consequences." They spent the next 2 hours going through the evidence against Linda. The phone records, the documented conversations with Elena Rodriguez, the clear violations of the restraining order, and the pattern of providing information that was being used to undermine Sarah's credibility in the federal case against Marcus. "We can charge her with violation of a protective order and obstruction of justice," Janet explained. "The obstruction charge is serious because she's interfering with a federal criminal case. If convicted, she could face up to 5 years in prison." Sarah thought about her mother, sitting in a federal prison, wearing an orange jumpsuit, finally facing consequences for her choices. The image should have been satisfying, but instead it just made her feel tired and sad. "I don't want her to go to prison," Sarah said finally.
I just want her to stop. I want her to understand that what she's doing is wrong and harmful. We might be able to work out a plea agreement, probation, community service, mandatory counseling about domestic violence. The goal would be education and deterrence rather than punishment. As they wrapped up the meeting, Janet gave Sarah information about victim advocacy services and counseling resources. The federal case against Marcus was going to take months to resolve, and Sarah would need support throughout the process. One more thing, Janet said as Sarah gathered her things. Marcus's electronic monitoring shows that he's been spending a lot of time at locations near elementary schools and parks in Phoenix. When his probation officer questioned him about it, he claimed he was visiting his nieces. Sarah felt a chill. He doesn't have nieces. His sister doesn't have children. That's what we thought. We're investigating further, but it suggests he might be violating the terms of his bail in other ways. If we can prove he's lying to his probation officer or engaging in prohibited activities, we can have his bail revoked. Driving back to her apartment, Sarah reflected on how much her life had changed since that first terrifying text message from Marcus 3 weeks ago. She had gone from victim to survivor to someone actively pursuing justice not just for herself, but potentially for other women who might become Marcus's targets in the future. The decision to file charges against her mother felt like the final step in reclaiming her agency. For too long, Sarah had prioritized family relationships over her own safety and well-being. She had made excuses for people who hurt her, had tried to maintain connections with people who actively worked against her interests. That evening, Jessica came over with Chinese takeout and wine, ready to hear about Sarah's meeting with the prosecutor. "So you're really going to press charges against your mom?" Jessica asked as they settled on the couch with their food. "I think I have to. Not because I want revenge, but because she needs to understand that actions have consequences. She's helping Marcus build a case against me, and she's doing it knowingly now. That's not just enabling anymore, that's active participation in abuse."
Nodded thoughtfully. It takes incredible strength to hold family members accountable. Most people would just keep trying to make excuses for her. I spent years making excuses for Marcus. I told myself he was just stressed, just insecure, just having a bad day. Making excuses for abusers doesn't help them get better. It just enables them to keep hurting people. As they talked, Sarah realized that prosecuting her mother wasn't about punishment or revenge. It was about breaking a cycle. Linda had spent her entire adult life enabling abusive men, first Sarah's father and now Marcus. If she didn't face real consequences for her choices, she would continue the pattern with the next abuser who charmed her. Besides, Sarah added, if she's willing to testify against me to help Marcus, then she's already chosen sides. The mother-daughter relationship is already over. At least this way, maybe she'll get the education she needs to understand why her choices are harmful. The next few days brought a flurry of legal activity. Janet Walsh filed charges against Linda for violation of a protective order and obstruction of justice. The charges were serious enough to warrant arrest, but Linda was allowed to surrender herself voluntarily rather than being picked up by federal marshals. Sarah learned about her mother's arrest through a text from Aunt Maria. "Your mom was arrested this morning. She's been released on her own recognizance, but she has to appear in court next week. She's devastated and angry. She says you've destroyed the family." The accusation stung, but Sarah recognized it as more manipulation. Linda wasn't devastated because she had enabled abuse or violated court orders. She was devastated because she was finally facing consequences for her choices. And rather than taking responsibility, she was blaming Sarah for the natural results of her own actions. Marcus's probation officer called Janet Walsh that same afternoon with troubling news. Electronic monitoring had tracked Marcus to several locations where he wasn't supposed to be, including near Sarah's old workplace in Phoenix and at the apartment complex where she had lived before moving to Portland. He's clearly trying to gather more information about Miss Chen, the probation officer explained. He's been to her old gym, her former doctor's office, even the coffee shop where she used to study. Someone is giving him detailed information about her previous routines and locations.
The pattern suggested that Marcus was building a comprehensive profile of Sarah's life, possibly planning some kind of retaliation or attempting to find ways to contact her despite the restraining orders. The electronic monitoring data also showed late-night visits to internet cafes, suggesting he might be creating fake online accounts to bypass social media blocks. "We're recommending that his bail be revoked immediately," the probation officer told Janet. "This level of surveillance and planning suggests he's a significant threat to Ms. Chen's safety." Sarah felt vindicated, but also frightened. Marcus's behavior proved that her fears had been justified, that the restraining orders and distance hadn't eliminated the threat he posed. His obsession with monitoring and controlling her had only intensified since his arrest. The bail revocation hearing was scheduled for the following Monday. Sarah wouldn't need to testify, but Janet wanted her to be present to observe the proceedings and to be available in case the judge had questions about Marcus's previous behavior. Over the weekend, Sarah received an unexpected call from Elena Rodriguez, Marcus's mother. The woman's voice was shaky and uncertain, very different from the confident manipulation Sarah had heard about in the prosecutor's reports. "Sarah, I need to talk to you. I think I made a terrible mistake." Sarah was tempted to hang up immediately. Any contact with Marcus's family could be seen as a violation of the restraining order, and she didn't trust Elena's motivations. "Mrs. Rodriguez, I can't talk to you. There's a restraining order in place." "Please, just listen for 1 minute. I found something."
Marcus's room, something that scared me. I think your mother and I were wrong about him. Against her better judgment, Sarah stayed on the line. What did you find? Pictures. Hundreds of pictures of you. Some were obviously taken without your knowledge, from a distance. And there were maps, Sarah. Maps of Portland, with locations marked. Your apartment, your work, places you go regularly. He's been planning something. Sarah's blood went cold. "Mrs. Rodriguez, you need to call the FBI immediately. That evidence could be crucial for keeping him in jail." "I already did. Agent Collins is coming to the house this afternoon." "But Sarah, I need you to know that I'm sorry. Your mother told me so many things about you, about your relationship with Marcus, and I believed her. I thought she knew you better than anyone. I thought she was being honest." Elena went on to explain that Linda had painted a picture of Sarah as manipulative and vindictive, someone who had used Marcus's love against him and then destroyed his reputation when he tried to end the relationship. She had convinced Elena that the abuse allegations were exaggerated or fabricated, that Sarah was using the legal system to punish Marcus for breaking up with her. But when I saw those pictures, when I saw how he's been tracking you, I realized that everything your mother told me was wrong. No one takes surveillance photos of someone they just want to talk to. No one maps out someone's daily routine unless they're planning to hurt them. After Elena hung up, Sarah immediately called Janet Walsh to report the conversation and the discovery of surveillance materials in Marcus's possession. This evidence would be devastating to his defense and would almost certainly result in his bail being revoked and additional charges being filed. "This proves premeditation," Janet explained. "He wasn't just impulsively contacting you or happening to be in Portland for other reasons. He was conducting organized surveillance with the intent to locate and possibly harm you." The bail revocation hearing on Monday was swift and decisive. Elena Rodriguez testified about finding the surveillance materials in her son's bedroom, turning over boxes of photographs, maps, and what appeared to be detailed notes about Sarah's daily routines in both Phoenix and Portland. Marcus's defense attorney tried to argue that the materials were just mementos from their relationship and evidence of Marcus's desire to understand why Sarah had left him. But the photos clearly showed surveillance activities, including images taken through windows and from hiding spots where Marcus couldn't possibly have been with Sarah's knowledge or consent. The judge revoked Marcus's bail immediately, ordering him held without bond pending trial. He also authorized additional charges, including interstate stalking, cyberstalking, and violation of pretrial release conditions.
Mr. Rodriguez, the judge said as federal marshals approached to take Marcus into custody, your behavior demonstrates a clear and ongoing threat to Ms. Chen's safety. You will remain in federal custody until this matter is resolved. Sarah watched from the gallery as Marcus was led away in handcuffs. For the first time since this ordeal began, she felt truly safe. Marcus was in federal custody, facing serious charges with substantial evidence against him. His own mother had provided the evidence that would likely ensure his conviction. But the victory felt incomplete. Her mother was still facing charges for her role in enabling Marcus's surveillance and harassment. Linda had court appearances scheduled for the following week, and she was reportedly furious that Sarah had refused to ask prosecutors to drop the charges. According to Aunt Maria, Linda was telling anyone who would listen that Sarah had lost her mind and was destroying the family for attention. She was portraying herself as the victim of an ungrateful daughter rather than taking responsibility for her choices. She still doesn't understand what she did wrong, Maria told Sarah during one of their regular check-in calls. She keeps saying she was
just trying to help, that she thought she was bringing the family back together. Sarah had stopped trying to understand her mother's motivations. Whether Linda's actions came from genuine misunderstanding or willful blindness didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that she had made choices that put Sarah in danger, and those choices had consequences. The federal prosecutor handling Linda's case called Sarah the following week to discuss a potential plea agreement. Linda's attorney was hoping to avoid trial and minimize the consequences for his client. Your mother is willing to plead guilty to violation of a protective order, the prosecutor explained. In exchange, we would drop the obstruction of justice charge and recommend probation with mandatory domestic violence education and community service. Sarah considered the offer carefully. Part of her wanted Linda to face the full consequences of her actions, to spend time in federal prison thinking about how her choices had enabled abuse. But another part of her recognized that education might be more valuable than punishment. What kind of domestic violence education? Sarah asked. A comprehensive program that includes understanding the dynamics of abuse, recognizing manipulation tactics, and learning how family members can either support or undermine victims' safety. It's designed specifically for people who have enabled abusers without fully understanding the harm they were causing. The program sounded like exactly what Linda needed. If she could genuinely learn to recognize abusive behavior and understand how her actions had put Sarah in danger, maybe some good could come from this devastating situation. I'll agree to the plea bargain on one condition, Sarah said. I want a restraining order to remain in place for at least 2 years, and I want her to complete the domestic violence education program before any contact between us is even considered. The prosecutor agreed to include those conditions in the plea agreement. Linda would plead guilty, receive 2 years of probation, complete 200 hours of community service with a domestic violence organization, and attend a year-long education program about recognizing and responding to abuse. Most importantly, she would be prohibited from contacting Sarah directly or indirectly for 2 years, giving Sarah time to heal and establish firm boundaries before deciding whether any relationship with her mother was possible. As Sarah hung up the phone, she felt a complex mixture of emotions. Relief that both Marcus and her mother were facing consequences for their actions, sadness that her family relationships had reached this point, and underneath it all, a growing sense of her own strength and worth. She had gone from being someone who accepted abuse and manipulation to someone who actively pursued justice and accountability. She had learned to prioritize her own safety and well-being over family loyalty and social expectations. The transformation hadn't been easy, and the cost had been high. But as Sarah looked around her Portland apartment, filled with plants and artwork she had chosen herself, she knew she had made the right choices. She was finally free to build the life she wanted, surrounded by people who respected and supported her. Marcus would likely spend years in federal prison. Her mother would spend the next 2 years learning about the harm she had caused and hopefully developing the tools to make better choices in the future. And Sarah would spend that time continuing to build her career, her friendships, and her sense of self.
For the first time in years, her future felt completely her own. 6 months after Marcus's bail was revoked, Sarah stood in the federal courthouse in Portland, watching as the jury foreman prepared to read the verdict. The trial had lasted 3 weeks, and during that time, Sarah had relived every moment of her relationship with Marcus, every instance of abuse, every manipulation tactic he had used to control her life. The courtroom was packed with people who had supported Sarah throughout the ordeal. Jessica sat
in the front row, having taken time off work to be present for the verdict. Aunt Maria had flown in from Phoenix, providing a family presence that felt genuinely supportive rather than manipulative. Even Amanda Flores and Jennifer Kim, the other women who had testified about Marcus's pattern of abuse, were there to hear the outcome. Marcus sat at the defense table, looking smaller than Sarah remembered. The months in federal custody had changed him. Gone was the arrogant confidence that had characterized his personality during their relationship. He looked pale and defeated, occasionally glancing toward the gallery where his parents sat in the back row. Elena Rodriguez had become an unexpected ally during the trial preparation. Her testimony about finding the surveillance materials in Marcus's room had been devastating to his defense, and she had expressed genuine remorse for her role in enabling his behavior. She had also provided crucial evidence about the coordination between Marcus and his attorney's efforts to gather information about Sarah through Linda. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Judge Catherine Mills asked, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had presided over hundreds of similar cases. "We have, Your Honor," the foreman replied, standing with a folded piece of paper in his hands. Sarah felt her heart racing despite months of preparation for this moment. Janet Walsh had warned her that domestic violence cases could be unpredictable, that juries sometimes struggled to understand the psychological dynamics of abuse or the serious nature of stalking behaviors. "On the charge of interstate stalking, how do you find?" "Guilty, Your Honor." Sarah felt Jessica squeeze her hand as the first guilty verdict was announced. There were multiple charges, each carrying significant prison time, but this first conviction established that the jury understood the seriousness of Marcus's behavior. "On the charge of cyberstalking, how do you find?" "Guilty, Your Honor." "On the charge of violation of a federal protective order, how do you find?" "Guilty, Your Honor." "On the charge of making interstate communications with intent to harass, how do you find?" "Guilty, Your Honor." By the time the foreman finished reading, Marcus had been found guilty on all 7 federal charges. The combined sentences could result in up to 15 years in federal prison, with requirements that he serve at least 85% of whatever sentence the judge imposed. Marcus's mother began crying quietly in the back of the courtroom, but Elena's tears seemed to be tears of relief rather than grief. She had spent months coming to terms with who her son really was, attending her own counseling sessions to understand how she had failed to recognize his dangerous behavior. Judge Mills scheduled sentencing for 6 weeks later, giving the probation department time to prepare a comprehensive pre-sentence report. As the courtroom began to empty, Sarah felt a complex mixture of emotions. Victory, certainly, but also exhaustion from the months of legal proceedings and testimony. Janet Walsh approached Sarah as they gathered their belongings. "How are you feeling?" "Relieved," Sarah said honestly, "but also kind of empty. I've been focused on this trial for so long that I'm not sure what comes next." "What comes next is that you get to live your life without looking over your shoulder. Marcus is going to federal prison for a very long time. When he gets out, he'll be on supervised probation for years, with strict conditions about contacting you or coming anywhere near Oregon." As they walked out of the courthouse together, Sarah reflected on how much her life had changed since that first terrifying text message almost a year ago. The trial had been emotionally challenging, requiring her to testify in detail about the abuse she had suffered and the fear she had experienced when Marcus tracked her to Portland. But the process had also been empowering in unexpected ways. For the first time, Sarah had been able to tell her complete story in a forum where Marcus couldn't interrupt, manipulate, or gaslight her. The jury had listened to her testimony with attention and respect, and their guilty verdicts had validated her experiences in a way that felt profoundly healing. The media coverage of the trial had been extensive, partly because of the interstate nature of the crimes, and partly because Sarah's story had resonated with domestic violence advocates across the country.
Several news outlets had covered the case as an example of how abusers increasingly use technology and cross-state mobility to continue harassing their victims. Sarah had given several interviews during the trial, hoping that sharing her experience might help other women recognize the warning signs of abuse or encourage them to seek help. The response had been overwhelming, with hundreds of messages from women sharing their own stories and thanking Sarah for her courage in pursuing prosecution. 3 weeks after the verdict, Sarah received a call that she had been both expecting and dreading. It was from the federal prosecutor handling her mother's case, informing her that Linda had completed her plea agreement and was ready to begin her court-ordered domestic violence education program. Your mother has been compliant with all the terms of her probation so far, the prosecutor explained. She's completed her community service hours at a women's shelter, and she's scheduled to begin the education program next week. Sarah had mixed feelings about her mother's progress. Part of her was glad that Linda was taking the court orders seriously and following through on her commitments. But another part of her remained skeptical about whether her mother was genuinely learning from the experience or just going through the motions to satisfy legal requirements. Has she expressed any interest in understanding why her actions were harmful? Sarah asked. According to her probation officer, she's still struggling with taking full responsibility. She acknowledges that she violated the restraining order, but she continues to maintain that her intentions were good and that she was trying to help you reconcile with Marcus. The response wasn't surprising, but it was disappointing. Sarah had hoped that facing criminal charges might force her mother to confront the reality of how her actions had enabled abuse. Instead, it sounded like Linda was still operating from the same mindset that had led her to betray Sarah in the first place. What happens if she doesn't show genuine progress in the education program? The program includes regular assessments and reports to the court. If the facilitators determine that she's not engaging meaningfully with the material or isn't demonstrating understanding of domestic violence dynamics, the court could extend her probation or impose additional requirements. Sarah appreciated that the legal system was taking her mother's education seriously, but she also recognized that real change would have to come from within Linda herself. No court order could force someone to genuinely understand the harm they had caused or to develop empathy for domestic violence victims. As autumn arrived in Portland, Sarah found herself settling into a new rhythm of life that felt genuinely peaceful for the first time in years. Her work at the marketing agency had flourished, and she had been promoted to senior designer with her own team of junior creatives. The stability and success felt surreal after so many months of chaos and legal proceedings. Jessica had become more than just a supportive friend. She had become chosen family. They had decided to move in together, finding a larger apartment in Portland's Pearl District that felt safe and luxurious compared to the small place where Sarah had hidden during the worst of her ordeal with Marcus. Sarah had also begun volunteering with a local domestic violence organization, helping other women navigate the legal system and understand their options for protection and prosecution. The work was emotionally challenging but deeply meaningful, allowing her to transform her traumatic experiences into tools for helping others. During one of her volunteer shifts, Sarah met a 19-year-old woman named Crystal whose story had disturbing parallels to her own. Crystal's ex-boyfriend had violated a restraining order by traveling from California to Oregon, and Crystal's sister was providing him with information about Crystal's whereabouts and daily routines. "I don't understand how she can do this to me," Crystal said during one of their conversations. "She knows what he did to me. She saw the bruises. She helped me pack my bags when I left. But now she's telling him where I work, where I live, who I'm dating?" Sarah recognized the confusion and betrayal in Crystal's voice, the same emotions she had felt when her own mother had chosen to enable Marcus rather than protect her daughter. Family members who enable abusers often have their own complicated relationships with control and manipulation, Sarah explained, drawing on what she had learned during her own healing process. Sometimes they genuinely believe they're helping. Sometimes they're so uncomfortable with conflict that they'll sacrifice your safety to avoid dealing with the abuser's anger. "But she's my sister. She's supposed to protect me." "I thought the same thing about my mother," Sarah replied. "I spent months trying to understand why she would choose to help my abuser instead of supporting me. Eventually, I realized that understanding her motivations was less important than protecting myself from the consequences of her choices."
Sarah helped Crystal document the sister's enabling behaviors and file for an expanded restraining order that would include the sister as well as the ex-boyfriend. The process was familiar now, and Sarah found satisfaction in using her hard-won knowledge to help another woman protect herself. Marcus's sentencing hearing arrived in late October, almost exactly 1 year after Sarah had first received that terrifying text message announcing his presence in Portland. Sarah had spent weeks preparing her victim impact statement, wanting to articulate not just the harm Marcus had caused her personally, but the broader impact of domestic violence on victims' families, careers, and communities. The courtroom was packed again, but this time the atmosphere felt different. Where the trial had been about establishing guilt or innocence, the sentencing hearing was about consequences and accountability. Sarah felt less anxiety and more determination as she prepared to address the court. Judge Mills called for victim impact statements, and Sarah approached the podium with a folder containing the speech she had written and revised dozens of times. Your Honor, when Marcus Rodriguez first began abusing me, I thought I was dealing with a personal problem that I could handle privately. I made excuses for his behavior, minimized the violence, and blamed myself for provoking his anger. I thought if I could just be a better girlfriend, if I could avoid triggering his jealousy or insecurity, the abuse would stop. Sarah's voice was steady as she continued, describing how Marcus's abuse had escalated over time and how his manipulation had isolated her from friends and opportunities. But domestic violence isn't a private problem. It's a crime that affects entire communities. When Marcus tracked me across 3 states to continue his harassment, he wasn't just violating my rights. He was demonstrating a level of obsession and entitlement that made him dangerous to any woman who might reject his advances in the future. She went on to describe the impact of his surveillance activities, the evidence found in his bedroom that showed months of planning and stalking behaviors. The photographs and maps found in his possession weren't souvenirs of a relationship. They were tools of predation. They showed a calculated effort to monitor and control my movements to gather information that could be used to harm me. This level of planning and surveillance suggests that Marcus would have escalated his behavior if he hadn't been stopped by law enforcement. Sarah also addressed the role her mother had played in enabling Marcus's continued harassment, speaking about the broader impact
of family members who failed to support domestic violence victims. Quote, domestic violence thrives in silence and isolation. When family members choose to maintain relationships with abusers, when they provide information that helps abusers continue their harassment, they become part of the abuse itself. My mother's decision to help Marcus locate me wasn't just a betrayal of our relationship. It was participation in a federal crime, unquote. As Sarah returned to her seat, she felt a sense of completion that had been building throughout the legal proceedings. She had told her story completely and honestly, had held both Marcus and her mother accountable for their choices, and had transformed her experience into advocacy for other victims. Marcus's attorney presented mitigation evidence, including letters from family members and claims that Marcus had been attending anger management classes while in custody. But the evidence of his calculated stalking behavior and the testimony from multiple victims made it clear that his crimes were serious and premeditated. Elena Rodriguez also addressed the court, apologizing for her son's behavior and acknowledging her own role in enabling his manipulation. Quote, I raised Marcus to believe that he was entitled to whatever he wanted, including relationships with women who had made it clear they didn't want to be with him, Elena said, her voice shaking with emotion. I taught him that persistence was romantic, that women who said no were just playing hard to get. I see now that I helped create a person who couldn't accept rejection, who believed he had the right to control and monitor the women in his life, unquote. Elena's testimony was unexpected and powerful, providing insight into how abusive behaviors were often learned and reinforced within family systems. Her willingness to accept responsibility for her role in Marcus's development stood in stark contrast to Linda's continued denial and defensiveness. Judge Mills took a brief recess before announcing the sentence, and Sarah used the time to call Jessica and update her on the proceedings. How do you feel about Elena's testimony? Jessica asked. Surprised, honestly. It takes courage to admit that you contributed to raising someone who commits serious crimes. It makes me think about the difference between her response and my mother's response to being held accountable, unquote. When court reconvened, Judge Mills delivered a sentence that exceeded what Sarah had hoped for.
Marcus would serve 12 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised probation with strict conditions including no contact with Sarah, no unsupervised internet access, and mandatory participation in a specialized treatment program for domestic violence offenders. Quote, "Mr. Rodriguez," Judge Mills said as she announced the sentence, "your crimes represent a serious escalation of domestic violence that crossed state lines and involved sophisticated surveillance and stalking behaviors. The evidence shows that you were planning further harassment or potentially violent acts against Ms. Chen. This sentence reflects both the seriousness of your crimes and the need to protect the community from your dangerous behaviors." Unquote. Marcus showed no emotion as the sentence was announced, but his parents began crying in the gallery. Sarah felt a mixture of relief and sadness watching them. Alina's growth and accountability stood in stark contrast to Marcus's continued denial and his father's apparent inability to comprehend the seriousness of his son's crimes. As the proceedings concluded and Marcus was led away in custody, Sarah felt a chapter of her life closing definitively. He would be in federal prison until she was in her late 40s, and by the time he was released, she would have built an entirely new life free from his influence. The media attention following the sentencing was intense, with several national news outlets covering the case as an example of how domestic violence had evolved in the digital age. Sarah gave interviews emphasizing the importance of taking restraining order violations seriously and the need for law enforcement to take cyberstalking seriously as well.
Understand how technology could be used as a tool of abuse. One interview with a national morning show focused on the role of family members in either supporting or undermining domestic violence victims. Sarah spoke candidly about her mother's betrayal and the decision to include Linda in the restraining order. "One of the most difficult aspects of my situation was realizing that my own mother was helping my abuser," Sarah told the interviewer. "Family members often don't understand that domestic violence isn't a relationship problem that can be solved through communication or compromise. It's a crime. When they try to mediate or encourage reconciliation, they're actually enabling continued abuse." The interviewer asked about Sarah's current relationship with her mother, and Sarah was honest about the ongoing estrangement. "My mother is currently completing a court-ordered education program about domestic violence. Whether we'll have a relationship in the future depends on whether she genuinely learns to understand how her actions put me in danger. Right now, she's still focused on defending her intentions rather than acknowledging the impact of her choices." The response to Sarah's media appearances was overwhelming. She received hundreds of messages from domestic violence survivors sharing their own experiences with family members who had enabled their abusers. Many women expressed gratitude for Sarah's willingness to speak publicly about the complexity of family dynamics in domestic violence situations. Several domestic violence organizations invited Sarah to speak at conferences and training sessions for law enforcement and victim advocates. She found these speaking opportunities meaningful, allowing her to educate professionals about the sophisticated ways modern abusers use technology and manipulation to maintain control over their victims. As winter arrived in Portland, Sarah received an unexpected letter forwarded through her attorney. It was from her mother, written as part of the domestic violence education program Linda was completing. The letter was different in tone from any communication Sarah had received from her mother since the restraining order was put in place. Instead of defensiveness and justification, Linda's words showed what appeared to be genuine reflection and regret. "Sarah, I am writing this letter as part of my education program, but more importantly, I am writing it because I finally understand how much harm I caused you. For months, I focused on defending my intentions and explaining why I thought I was helping. I realize now that my intentions don't matter if the impact of my actions was to put you in danger." Linda went on to describe what she had learned about domestic violence dynamics, acknowledging that her own history with Sarah's father had left her with distorted ideas about what constituted normal relationship behavior. "I grew up believing that love meant accepting whatever treatment someone gave you, that relationships required sacrifice and compromise, even when that compromise involved accepting abuse. I thought if you could just find a way to make Marcus happy, the violence would stop. I see now that I was applying the same broken thinking that kept me trapped with your father for so many years." The letter included specific acknowledgments of the ways Linda's actions had violated Sarah's trust and safety, including detailed recognition of how providing information to Elena Rodriguez had enabled Marcus's continued harassment. I gave Marcus's mother information about your therapy, your struggles with anxiety, your reasons for moving to Portland. I told myself I was just venting to another concerned parent, but I see now that I was providing ammunition that they used to attack your credibility in court.
Requirements. While some passages seemed authentic, Sarah remained cautious about trusting her mother's apparent transformation. She showed the letter to her therapist, Dr. Williams, who had been helping her process the complex emotions surrounding both Marcus's abuse and her mother's betrayal. "What's your gut reaction to reading this?" Dr. Williams asked. "Relief, I think, and also skepticism. Part of me wants to believe that she finally understands what she did wrong, but another part of me remembers all the time she manipulated me before, all the time she seemed to understand my perspective, only to turn around and enable more abuse." Dr. Williams nodded thoughtfully. "It's important to trust your instincts, especially given your history. Even if your mother has genuinely learned from this experience, that doesn't automatically repair the trust that was broken or eliminate the need for boundaries." Sarah had been thinking about boundaries a lot lately. The legal system had provided external boundaries through restraining orders and criminal charges, but she was learning to create internal boundaries based on her own values and needs rather than others' expectations. As spring approached, marking almost 18 months since Marcus had first tracked her to Portland, Sarah made a decision about her mother. She would respond to Linda's letter, but she would maintain the boundaries established by the restraining order until she felt genuinely confident that her mother had changed. Sarah's response was brief but honest. "I received your letter, and I appreciate the reflection it contains. Real change takes time to demonstrate, not just in words, but in consistent actions and choices. If you have genuinely learned from this experience, you will understand why I need to see that change sustained over time before considering any contact between us." The response felt appropriate, acknowledging her mother's apparent growth while maintaining the protections Sarah needed to continue healing and building her life. Sarah's career continued to flourish throughout the spring. Her work with domestic violence organizations had led to consulting opportunities with tech companies interested in developing better safety features for their platforms. She found this work particularly meaningful, using her experience to help create tools that could protect other victims from digital stalking and harassment. She had also begun writing a book about her experience, working with a literary agent who specialized in memoirs about overcoming trauma. The book would focus not just on surviving domestic violence, but on navigating the complex family dynamics that often surrounded abuse situations. "Your story is important because it shows how domestic violence affects entire family systems," her agent explained during one of their meetings. "Too many people still think of domestic violence as something that happens between two people in private. Your experience demonstrates how abusers manipulate family members and social networks to maintain control over their victims." As summer approached, Sarah received notification that Marcus had been transferred to a federal prison in Texas, far from both Oregon and Arizona. The distance felt symbolic, representing the complete separation between her current life and the trauma he had inflicted. She had also learned that Marcus's parents were divorcing, with Elena citing irreconcilable differences about how to handle their son's crimes. According to Elena, who had maintained occasional contact with Sarah's Aunt Maria, Marcus's father continued to believe that Marcus was the victim of a vindictive legal system rather than a domestic violence perpetrator. "Some people never learn," Aunt Maria told Sarah during one of their regular phone calls. "But Elena has really changed. She's been volunteering with a family support group for parents of domestic violence perpetrators. She's trying to help other families recognize warning signs and avoid the mistakes she made."
Sarah felt glad that something positive had come from Elena's
experience, even as she maintained no contact with Marcus's family. The contrast between Alina's accountability and her own mother's slower journey toward understanding remained stark. As Autumn returned to Portland, marking 2 years since her ordeal began, Sarah received a call from the federal prosecutor handling her mother's case. Linda had successfully completed her domestic violence education program and was requesting modification of the restraining order to allow limited contact with Sarah. The program facilitators report that your mother showed genuine engagement with the material and demonstrated significant growth in her understanding of domestic violence dynamics, the prosecutor explained. However, the decision about modifying the restraining order is entirely yours. You have no obligation to allow contact, even if she's completed the program. Sarah asked for time to consider the request, discussing it extensively with Dr. Williams, Jessica, and her Aunt Maria. The decision felt weighty, representing not just whether to allow contact with her mother, but how to define family relationships going forward. What would contact with her look like? Sarah asked during a therapy session. What would I need to see from her to believe that she's genuinely changed? Dr. Williams encouraged Sarah to think about specific behaviors and boundaries that would help her feel safe in any potential relationship with Linda. Genuine change isn't just about understanding domestic violence in the abstract, Dr. Williams explained. It's about consistently making choices that prioritize your safety and well-being, even when those choices are difficult or uncomfortable. After weeks of consideration, Sarah decided to allow limited contact with her mother, but with strict conditions. They would start with supervised phone calls facilitated by a family counselor who specialized in domestic violence situations. Linda would need to demonstrate sustained understanding of her role in enabling Marcus's abuse, and any contact would be contingent on her continued respect for Sarah's boundaries. The first phone call, scheduled for a Friday afternoon in November, was awkward but not hostile. Linda's voice sounded different, less defensive and more tentative than Sarah remembered. "Sarah, I want you to know that I don't expect forgiveness or even a relationship," Linda said early in the conversation. "I'm grateful that you're willing to try this at all. I know I have a lot to prove." They talked for 30 minutes about safe topics. Linda's volunteer work at the women's shelter, Sarah's career success, the weather in the respective cities. The conversation felt stilted, but not dangerous, lacking the manipulation and boundary pushing that had characterized their interactions before. "I've been thinking a lot about your father," Linda said toward the end of the call, "about how I normalized his emotional abuse and taught you that women should accept whatever treatment they receive from men. I see now that I passed those toxic beliefs on to you, and that's part of why you stayed with Marcus as long as you did." The acknowledgement felt significant to Sarah, representing a level of self-reflection that Linda had never demonstrated before. But Sarah remained cautious, knowing that real change would need to be demonstrated through consistent actions over time. As the call ended, Sarah felt emotionally drained, but not traumatized. The conversation had been difficult, but manageable, and Linda had respected the boundaries and structure that had been established. "How do you feel?" the family counselor asked after Linda had hung up. "Cautiously optimistic. She seemed different, but I need to see if this change is sustainable or if it's just temporary behavior to get back into my life." They scheduled monthly calls for the following 6 months, with the understanding that contact would continue only if Linda maintained respect for boundaries and continued demonstrating genuine understanding of her role in enabling abuse. As December arrived, marking the second anniversary of Marcus's sentencing,
Sarah reflected on the extraordinary transformation her life had undergone. She had gone from victim to survivor to advocate, from someone who accepted abuse as normal to someone who actively fought for accountability and justice. Her book was scheduled for publication the following spring, and she had signed contracts to speak at several national conferences about domestic violence and family dynamics. The marketing agency had promoted her to creative director, and she was leading projects for major national clients. Most importantly, she had built a life surrounded by people who respected and supported her.
Jessica had become the sister she had always wanted, providing unconditional love without manipulation or conditions. Her volunteer work connected her with other survivors who understood her experience without judgment. Even her tentative reconciliation with her mother represented growth rather than regression. Sarah was no longer desperate for family approval or willing to sacrifice her safety for the appearance of normal relationships. Instead, she was choosing to cautiously explore whether a healthy relationship with Linda was possible while maintaining firm boundaries and realistic expectations. On New Year's Eve, as Sarah stood on the balcony of her Pearl District apartment watching fireworks over the Willamette River, she felt a profound sense of peace and possibility. Marcus was in federal prison and would remain there for many years. Her mother was working to understand and change the behaviors that had enabled abuse, and Sarah herself had transformed from victim to survivor to someone who used her experience to help others. The journey had been painful and expensive, costing her relationships, security, and years of her life. But it had also revealed strength she hadn't known she possessed and connected her with a community of people who understood the complexity of surviving domestic violence. As the fireworks burst overhead, Sarah made a resolution for the coming year: to continue using her voice and experience to help other women recognize their worth and fight for their safety. The trauma that had once threatened to destroy her had become the foundation for a life of meaning and purpose. Jessica joined her on the balcony as the celebration continued around them, and they stood together watching the city sparkle below. "Any regrets?" Jessica asked, knowing how much Sarah had sacrificed to reach this point. Sarah thought about the question seriously, considering all of the pain and loss that had brought her to this moment of peace and strength. "No," she said finally. "I regret that it took me so long to understand my worth. I regret that other women are going through similar experiences right now, but I don't regret fighting for my safety or holding people accountable for their choices. This life, this freedom, this sense of my own power, it was worth fighting for." As the new year began, Sarah looked forward to continued growth, to using her platform to advocate for other survivors, and to building relationships based on mutual respect rather than manipulation or control. The woman who had once accepted abuse as the price of love had become someone who understood that real love never required accepting harm. The betrayal that had once felt like the end of her world had actually been the beginning of a new one, built on foundations of strength, boundaries, and authentic connections with people who valued her safety and well-being above their own comfort or convenience. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.